Joy woke up in the middle of the night and let out a thunderous cry. She woke other prison inmates. She had held the pain for a long time, so she decided to let it out before her heart burst. Other prison inmates held her, some got mad at her for disturbing their sleep. Joy could no longer bear the pain of taking herself to the prison without committing any crime. She cringed whenever she remembers that she had wasted her youth. She tried to make friends in the prison and move on with her life, but the pain of the foolishness that landed her in the prison often resists her happiness, no matter how much she tries. Joy was a house girl to one Mrs. Stella, a renowned politician. Joy was born into a poor family, but due to teenage influence, she denied her family background. Throughout her stay in the university, Joy always paraded herself as one from a rich home. She became Mrs. Stella's house help since her 200 level in the university. Many of her course mates envied her because she paraded herself as Mrs. Stella's daughter. Mrs. Stella was in her late 50s. Her husband was late and she had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Mrs. Stella sent her kids to UK to acquire their education. She has been into politics since her 30s. Her children were already married with kids, so she was a mother and a grandmother. Mrs. Stella treated Joy as a daughter. She paid her more than enough. She even gave Joy one of her cars. Joy cruised with the car throughout her days in the university. Joy bragged a lot and often threatened people to deal with them. She was living a fake life. Being that she had access to every nook and cranny of Mrs. Stella's house, sometimes she wore her jewelries to school and parties, especially whenever Mrs. Stella travels out of the country. After graduation, with the help of Mrs. Stella, Joy secured a government job. She pleaded with Mrs. Stella to remain in her house. She preferred taking cover with Mrs. Stella's name and prestige. Mrs. Stella one day called Joy to advise her to minimize the level of her fake life and cut her coat according to her size. That was supposed to be a motherly advice, but Joy took it to another dimension. She never knew that Mrs. Stella was aware of her fake life. Secondly, being that Mrs. Stella mentioned about her real family which she had abandoned, she felt so embarrassed. She decided to divert her plan. She needed a huge amount of money from Mrs. Stella to start her life. She won't need anyone to remind of her background nor advise her about her life. One day, Joy planned with some guys to kidnap her. She was kidnapped, Mrs. Stella was called and 50 million naira ransom was asked from her. The money was too much, so she involved the police and vigilante groups. After 3 days, Joy and her friends were caught by the vigilante. Out of motherly mercy, Mrs. Stella did not take the matter up. She forgave Joy but sent her out of her house. She gave Joy 5 million naira to start her life. Joy regretted her action. She pleaded with Mrs. Stella severally to accept her back, but Mrs. Stella was unbent. In less than 6 months, election season came, and Mrs. Stella passed the primary election as the OPC flag bearer for the Annam South House of Assembly candidate. Joy saw this as an opportunity to return to her fake mother. Despite being rejected by Mrs. Stella, she still paraded herself as Mrs. Stella's daughter. She championed the campaign for Mrs. Stella. She was visually everywhere. She formed a foundation and was reaching out to the less privileged under Mrs. Stella's name. She formed different social media groups for Mrs. Stella's campaign. She visited different universities for campaign. She did all this with her money. She did all this hoping that Mrs. Stella would forgive and call her back. Mrs. Stella was aware of all that. She knew that Joy was putting in all her efforts to get back to her. She did not need all that, because she can't put up with Joy's fake life. Arguably, Mrs. Stella stood more chance than her opponents in the election. She was loved by all because of her previous record as the local government chairlady. Usually, during election, candidates tread with caution because their opponents can do anything to pull them down. This was why she kept Joy away, because she knew Joy can do anything for money. Joy was materialistic. One day, Mrs. Stella entered her house with her bodyguards after a long day at different campaign grounds. She found her new house help murdered in a cold blood in her apartment. Without hesitation, she called the police. All her efforts to conceal the lady's death till after election proved abortive. She knew that was the deed of one of her opponents. People began to spread the rumor that she used the house help for sacrifice in order to win election. The news circulated everywhere, on different social media platforms. She stopped going for campaigns because people no longer want to hear her. She was forced to step down by her party chairman, but she refused. The pressure became too much and she was sued to court to prove her innocence. She was at the verge of losing her career when Joy stepped in. Joy visited her one night to strike a deal with her. Initially, she did not want to see Joy because she was suspecting everyone around her. Joy told her that she can save her name. She decided to give Joy a listening ear. Joy told her that she can step in as the murderer but on one condition. Joy's condition was that when Mrs. Stella wins the election, Mrs. Stella should do anything within her powers to take her out of the prison, after which she will settle her with sum of 100 million naira. Mrs. Stella accepted the condition without a second thought. Joy was arrested. She told the police that she killed the house girl because she tried to stop her from entering her mother's house. Joy was tried. She pleaded guilty without remorse. She was confident that Mrs. Stella would bring her out. Joy was sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite the incident, people still loved and cherished Mrs. Stella. Her opponents knew that she stood more chance of winning the election. However, the pressure to step down, from the party chairman and party members became so hot that she began to suspect that they had hand in the girl's murder. She was receiving different threatening messages and signs. Some days, she would be attacked during campaign or her way home. One day, Mrs. Stella woke up in the hospital. It turned out that she was poisoned. Though she was saved, but the poison made her weak and she became seriously sick. Then she decided to step down. She was taken to UK by her daughter for effective treatment. She suffered the poison for a few months before her recovery. She knew that Joy was still in the prison, but there was nothing she could do because she was threatened by Anonymous that if she ever returns to Nigeria she would be killed. Joy waited from weeks to months and years for Mrs. Stella, but to no avail. Though she knew Mrs. Stella stepped down from her post, but she expected her to use her influence as a politician to take her out from the prison. This time, she no longer cared about the money. All she wanted was her freedom. This was how Joy, a 25-year-old lady, full of life and future, lost her freedom because of fake life and material things. Let's take life easy. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel.